Tony Abbott, welcome to Straight Talk.
Mark, it's wonderful to be with you.
You are, by the way, my mum's, it sounds very trite and commonplace, but my mum's favourite politician.
Well, your mum must have been a wonderful woman.
Good start, mate. Thanks very much for coming in. So maybe, if possible, I don't know if many people know much about you, other than the fact that you were Prime Minister of the country, for that matter, but and there's some instances where they remember you with, the budgie smugglers, shirt
The
fronting
onion,
Putin,
all that sort of
and
stuff.
the onion.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about those
Yeah,
things because
yeah,
they're fun things.
yeah.
But if we could just go back a bit,
Sure.
ideology is an important thing in the way we conduct ourselves and our behaviour, all of us, and it's also what we tend to believe in. And our ideology, I think, is formed largely from how we grew up, influences us on us when we were kids, etc. So who's Tony Abbott, the kid?
Well, I had two wonderful parents, my late father, my mum, who's still with us at 92.
Wow.
I grew up in a lovely, tranquil neighbourhood, in a house backing on the bush.
Sydney or
in
no?
Sydney.
Yep.
Mum and Dad had a good marriage. I had three younger sisters who claim to worship me, although they don't give that much evidence these days. Mum reckoned they did. I went to school, first of all, at Holy Family Convent, Linfield, then at St. Aloysius College, Milsons Point, then at St. Ignatius College, Riverview, Sydney University, Economics Law. Was lucky enough to get a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford.
Could you just stop there?
Yeah.
What is a Rhodes Scholarship? Everyone talks about it, no one knows what it is.
Okay, well, a Rhodes Scholarship is a scholarship funded out of the bequest of Cecil Rhodes, who was a mining magnate in the country, which was known as Rhodesia. After him, he was the first Prime Minister of Rhodesia back in the 1890s, a mining magnate, and when he died in 1902, his fortune, which doesn't sound like much in these days' money, but it was about £3 million, it funded the Rhodes Scholarships. It's done that to this day because it's been very well invested. The Rhodes Scholarship is essentially a leadership scholarship. Cecil Rhodes said that he wanted men for the world's fight. And so every year, each state, each of Australia's 6 states sends a Rhodes Scholar to Oxford. There are 3 Australia at large Rhodes Scholarships, so that's 9 Rhodes Scholars go from Australia every year to Oxford. They've got to be bright. They're supposed to be potential leaders. In the old days, at least, they were usually people who had achieved a bit in sport. And so I guess I didn't have a stellar academic record by any means, but I'd been the president of the Students' Council at Sydney Uni. I'd played quite a bit of first-grade rugby. So I guess that's how I got there as a Rhodes Scholar. Previous Rhodes Scholars in politics included Bob Hawke, Kim Beazley. Malcolm Turnbull was also a Rhodes Scholar a couple of years before me. So there's been a lot of Rhodes Scholars over the years go into public life, and I guess that's fitting because in his will, Cecil Rhodes said he wanted to produce leaders, and the idea was to bring the leaders of the English-speaking world. There's 30-odd Rhodes Scholars a year from America. There are some from Canada. There are quite a few from South Africa as well. For a while, there were Rhodes Scholars from Germany. The idea was to bring the potential leaders of the major countries of the world, particularly in the English-speaking world, to Oxford, where it was thought by Cecil Rhodes these young men and subsequently young women would get the best possible education and would develop the kind of comradeship between each other that would lead to a more peaceful and harmonious world.
That's a probably good introduction to asking you a question, and I know it's probably a bit early because we are talking about yourself growing up, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But what do you think about leadership today? I mean, what do you think Cecil Rhodes would think about? And of course, Rhodesia used to be Rhodesia, now called Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
What would he
Yeah.
now? think about leadership outside of the Rhodes Scholarships, but think about leadership and what does it mean? What does leadership mean? I don't know what it means to someone like you.
Yeah, okay. Well, a leader is someone who can make a decision that involves people other than simply himself or herself and can make the decision stick. So a leader's got to know his or her own mind, has got to be capable of turning thoughts into resolutions, communicating successfully those resolutions to others, and encouraging, inspiring, persuading others to join in with those resolutions. That's essentially leadership. And whether whether leadership is exercised in persuading your mates that we should go and see film X rather than film Y, whether leadership is exercised in getting together a group of people to go on a holiday, whether it's starting a business, whether it's leading a country. Leadership is exercised in all sorts of different ways by all sorts of different people, but without leadership, nothing happens.
So where does courage fit in leadership? That virtue, because I just don't think we talk about virtues enough. But where does the virtue of courage fit into leadership for, say, running a country? Let's not decide who's going to go to the movies. Let's just say we're running a country because that's your area of expertise, or certainly your former area of expertise. And you mentioned a number of other former prime ministers in the same category, or leaders of the opposition. You would have seen common traits. Was courage a common trait?
I think courage is an important part of good leadership. I think courage is pretty rare. It was Lord Slim who said moral courage is a far higher and rarer virtue than physical courage. It was our old friend Father Emmett Costello who used to frequently quote an obscure French cardinal that I'd never heard of, but nevertheless Emmett loved his phrase.
Emmett Costello being the Jesuit priest from Review?
Yes. Emmett kept quoting this Cardinal Pie from the 19th century who said, prudence is everywhere, courage is nowhere, we will all die of prudence. And I must say, I think that's quite a useful reminder that prudence is a virtue, but it's not the only virtue. Courage is equally and no less important.
So, because I will come back to your history in a second because I want to know more about it. But just on that topic, I think it was Aristotle who said that there was courage was he talked about the golden mean, which was the point between reckless or fearless. Fearless, reckless, or I should say, which is down one end of the scale, and on the other end of the scale was you were a coward.
Yeah.
And courage was the gold mean, somewhere in between, not in the middle, but somewhere, and different for everybody.
Yeah.
But if you're becoming a leader of a country, it would seem to me that finding that golden mean as a leader of the country, as a prime minister, leading your party, in this case in Australia, in America's leading the country, a bit different. But do you think that we've lost that courage a little bit?
Well, if you look at our political leadership, Mark, I think that it peaked in the Hawke-Howard era. Hawke and Howard, each in his own way, they were both very, very effective and quite brave prime ministers. Hawke defied Labor orthodoxy to, deregulate the labour market, to privatise or begin privatisation processes, to reduce tariffs, to keep the unions more or less in their lane. And then Howard did things like introduce work for the dole. He brought in tax reform. He reformed the waterfront. Hawke did most of his reforms with the support of the coalition. So at one level, they were easier to do because they weren't opposed in the parliament the way Howard's reforms were ferociously opposed by the Labor Party. But nevertheless, I wouldn't underestimate the courage that both Hawke and Keating showed in the economic sphere because, frankly, it's a very unusual Labor leader who can get out of the old Marxist capital versus Labor paradigm and appreciate that workers do best when the boss does well too. So we had a quarter century of good leadership, really excellent, outstanding leadership under Hawke and Howard. I think it's been of lesser quality since then, and that's not because the individuals are necessarily of lesser calibre, but I suspect there's certainly been less courage, and I think in some instances less character.
And then how much do you think courage is, or courage derives from what is possible? So it would seem to me, particularly these days, with the ability to know what people think, polling, um, and the ability to try and satisfy as many people as you possibly can in order to stay in government, because if you're not in government, you can't make change. How much do you think courage is being diluted by more information and not as ideologically based as it would have maybe in the past?
I think political leadership is more difficult today because social media and the 24/7 news cycle means that you tend to be more distracted. I mean, in Howard's time, you basically had to worry about the nightly newses and the morning's papers, but you're constantly being besieged by the media today. So I think in one sense, leadership is more difficult, but um, what do you want in a leader? You want character, you want conviction, you want courage, you want judgment, and frankly, you also want luck. Some people have it, some people don't. But I think that far too often these days, politicians consult the polls, they consult the focus group, and they allow themselves not to give the public what the public needs, but they try to give the public what the public wants. Now, we're all human, so we tend to want to have our cake and eat it too. And the truth is, you can't mostly do that. You've got to make choices, often hard choices. And in the Hawke-Howard era, there was a greater tendency on the part of our leadership to say, look, this is what's right for the country. This is the argument in favour. And they would prosecute the case. That's much less common. I mean, let's take the vexed subject of climate change, for instance. Now, the Liberal Party is having a huge internal discussion at the moment about energy and climate policy. One of the reasons why we are so angst-ridden over abandoning the straitjacket of net zero is because we think the public have been totally, if you like, they've basically been brainwashed into accepting that there is a climate crisis. Now, I don't think there is a climate crisis. I think reducing emissions is nice to do, but I don't think it's something that should dominate our policy making as it does right now. I think what the coalition should be prepared to do is to say, look, frankly, net zero is leading us down a path of economic ruin. We have to abandon it. My former colleagues are very worried that doing this will cost them seats and prevent them from winning the so-called teal seats back. But if it's actually right, I think the important thing is to make the case and argue it day in, day out between now and the next election. And if you fail and you still believe it's right, keep arguing it. I mean, take the GST, for instance. The GST, or at least a general goods and services tax, was first proposed by Keating at the time of the tax summit in 1985. The Prime Minister, Hawke, decided it was a step too far. That was when, I suppose, Hawke's caution and judgment trumped Keating's innovation and political courage. Then the GST was proposed by John Hewson, as you'd remember, Mark,
Mhm.
in the Fight Back package, and Keating, having supported it back in 85, ferociously opposed it in the 93 election. And then eventually the GST was brought in because John Howard had the guts to take it to the people in the 1998 election. So the GST was an idea that even its proponents eventually shied away from. Then it was an idea that was ferociously fought about, initially unsuccessfully, finally successfully, and now it's totally accepted. So it is possible to put forward policy initiatives that you think are right, but which are fiercely resisted, and you just argue your way through to success. And it is the mark of a successful country that it can make tough decisions, and that its leaders can successfully persuade people to change their minds on things. And I think that if you believe, as I do, that reducing emissions is no more than nice to do, if you think that the important thing for the long-term well-being of our country is economic growth, more jobs, more successful and more dynamic industries, all of which requires an abundance of cheap and reliable power, all of which requires continuing our mineral resources, agricultural, etc. development. If you think this is necessary, well, and if you think that the net zero straitjacket is gravely impeding all of this, well, then you should be prepared to argue the case.
And that's
Keep
that's
arguing it.
leadership.
That's leadership.
Thank you.
And another example, if I may say so, Mark,
Please.
of successful leadership, initially very much against the odds, was the whole Voice debate that we had a couple of years back. I mean, initially, the Voice was pitched as just a lovely, gracious mark of politeness and courtesy towards our Aboriginal fellow Australians. In fact, this was a Trojan horse in the heart of government. And thanks to courageous individuals, particularly Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine, also Peter Dutton and others, thanks to those courageous individuals, the public were persuaded that something that they'd initially supported out of an abundance of goodwill was something that they should oppose out of an abundance of political judgment.
And so in your world, when you were the Prime Minister, what points do you remember where you had to tap yourself on the shoulder and say, okay, Tony, it's time to stand up straight and exercise courage in relation to leading this country? What's some examples that you experienced? And what was it like too? I mean, did you have to fight within your own party? Where does it go?
It's a very good question.
Apart from daily.
Yeah. I guess one of the biggest fights in my time was what to do about illegal boat arrivals. And you'll remember that it started up at the end of the Keating era. It got worse during the Howard era. After the Tampa business, effectively the boats were stopped. And then they started up again under Kevin Rudd when Kevin Rudd closed down offshore processing and abolished temporary protection visas and so on. And in, I think, August of 2013, we had 5,000 illegal arrivals by boat. So it was a real crisis. We think that during the course of the Rudd-Gillard government, as well as 50,000 illegal arrivals in 1,000 boats, there were at least 1,000 people who died at sea doing this very unsafe business of jumping in a leaky fishing boat and trying to cross the 300 kilometres of open sea between Java and Christmas Island. Anyway, it was very important to stop this. What was happening at the time was that as soon as an Australian naval or customs vessel hove into view, the people smugglers would scuttle their boats. The passengers would be in the water. Our personnel naturally had to pick them up to stop them from drowning. Under Rudd and Gillard, they were all taken to Christmas Island, where effectively all of them eventually got to Australia, and many of them are still here to this day. What I determined we would do, and obviously this was done in consultation with my shadow cabinet colleagues, particularly Scott Morrison, who was the relevant shadow minister, we decided under Operation Sovereign Borders that we would hold the people, the would-be illegal migrants, we would hold them on a mothership until a calm night when we would put them in a big orange life raft just outside Indonesian territorial waters,
which is where they came from,
with just enough fuel to get back to Java. And this was hugely controversial at the time. When I said that we would turn boats around when it was safe to do so, Kevin Rudd, the Prime Minister at the time, said that this was not only illegal, it was not only immoral, but it was it would cause conflict with Indonesia. And that certainly was the view of many of the officials when I became Prime Minister. And I said, look, no self-respecting country can accept what amounts to a peaceful invasion. No self-respecting country can lose control of its borders. We simply have to stop this. And frankly, we should not allow somewhat nebulous concepts like international law, which can't be enforced in any court that has effective control over the actors. We shouldn't let that stop us. And because it was so remarkably successful so quickly, a policy that was hugely contentious at the time is now, however begrudgingly by the left, is now accepted. And to its credit, the Albanese government has largely maintained the border protection practices that began in my time and that were then continued through the Turnbull and Morrison eras as well.
And when you came up with this idea to do this, what was your objective? Was it a matter of principle, or is it a matter of principle that people shouldn't be just allowed to turn up whenever they feel like it and they're coming through illegal processes, etc.? Or was there something else beyond that? Economically made sense, or it didn't make sense economically? What was your objective behind it?
Well, Mark, the principle is countries have got to keep control of their borders. I mean, the mark of a sovereign country is that it keeps control of its borders. It controls who comes or doesn't come into the country. So that was the principle. And the mechanism for realising the principle was to stop the illegal boats. And the best way to stop the illegal boats was to turn them back. And if the original boats were sunk or otherwise destroyed, we gave them substitute boats and sent them back in the unsinkable orange life raft. So the end was national sovereignty, the means was turning boats around, and the mechanism was supplying boats where the people smugglers' boats were no longer available.
And I asked John Howard a couple of weeks ago about this, but is national sovereignty should that be a value that gets attributed to the nation?
Well, Mark, ask yourself this: what might people make huge sacrifices for, even their life if necessary? Your family, your faith, your country. I think that patriotism, love of country, is one of the most powerful emotions that people have. And yes, I think we certainly should respect it and, in appropriate circumstances, appeal to it.
That's very interesting. So it's a high order value, a very high order value, and maybe one that some generations might be not that tuned into these days.
Well, if you go back to the generations that fought the First and the Second World Wars, they obviously had a very strong sense of patriotism. Now, it's possible, indeed it's certain, that the patriotism of Australians at the time of the two world wars was, if you like, an empire patriotism as well as simply a national patriotism. But I think that Australians today still feel strongly patriotic. I think that official Australia is less inclined to appeal to people's patriotism. One of the reasons why I wrote my book, Mark, was because I think we've got a proud history. I think there's far more to look back on with pride and satisfaction than there is to look back on with shame and embarrassment. But I think these days, official Australia has very much imbibed what Geoffrey Blainey once called the black armband view of our history. It's interesting that many people on the left of politics don't want us to be particularly excited about Australia Day because they see that in terms of sorrow more than they see it in terms of pride and achievement. So I think it is important if citizens are to feel appropriately proud of their country that they have a good understanding of our history, particularly given that our history is, on balance, such a shining success. But yes, patriotism is very important, and if our country is to flourish, people need to have a strong sense of commitment to it and a strong desire not just to succeed themselves, but to have the country succeed too.
Do you think that one of the reasons perhaps that patriotism, as opposed to nationalism, patriotism, feeling pride in your country has somewhat diminished over the past maybe 10 years because Australia has done so well economically. Our unemployment is so low, and it always has been for a long, and definitely even during the COVID period, the government managed to keep unemployment where no one else was. And post COVID, Australia's unemployment was at record levels because, generally speaking, unemployment is up in the fives. But these days, it's still down to 4. When it gets to 4.5, it's a headline. Do you think that there's a generation of people here who have had it so good that they just think this is a place, Australia is a place, and we use it like a utility, and therefore we don't need to have any patriotism because we don't work hard enough for it? Do you think that's a point? Because, you and I are a similar generation. Important to get your job, important to work hard, important to respect the boss, important to respect the business that you work for. You didn't jump between job to job. Generally speaking, you stayed for a period of time because it was really important to have a job. It was jammed into us.
Yeah.
Respect as well for your boss. But these days, people can leave a job 6 months and they get another one because there's unemployment so low. Do you think that there is a correlation between unemployment and maybe the diminution in patriotism towards the country that that is looking after you?
Mark, I certainly do think that we've had it very good for a very long time in this country, and I do think that ease and luxury can breed indulgence and entitlement, and I think they're vices, if you like. I suspect that we might suffer from those vices a little more than we did, and I personally wish it were otherwise. Earlier generations of Australians did have a tougher life, physically, financially, and I think they were more alive to the need for sacrifice, to do one's duty, to be prepared to live a life of service. I think people were more in tune with that. And again, one of the reasons why I've written this history is to remind people today of the strengths of our forebears, both individually and collectively, because you never know what's around the corner. We think that the world will continue more or less as it is, that our country will always be rich, that our country will always be safe. that our country will always be free. But look at other countries where people aren't safe, they aren't free, they aren't rich, or they might be rich enough, but they're certainly not free. I mean, the world over the last 200 years has basically been shaped by the long Anglo-American ascendancy. We are a product of the long Anglo-American ascendancy. Our institutions, our attitudes, our way of life, all fundamentally shaped by the Anglo-American ascendancy. If the world of the future is dominated by China, for instance, it'll be a very different world, much less free, certainly. I would say much less fair, and fundamentally, in the long run, I suspect much less rich, because I don't believe that a basically totalitarian society can be as creative as a free society such as ours can be. And it's quite possible, maybe even likely, that tensions between the democracies and the dictatorships, which are operating in a kind of a informal alliance, the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, the North Koreans, it's quite likely that tensions at some point could boil over into conflict. I mean, we've got conflict in Ukraine, we've got conflict in the Middle East, we've got enormous tensions in East Asia. And as a country, we have to be prepared economically, militarily, and above all else, psychically, for whatever might come. And I just hope that if we do face much fiercer challenges than we have in recent times, that we will be ready for it and up for it.
Do you think it's, I often ponder on this particular question, and in terms of attitude and mindset, do you think it's, and often I think to myself, you and I are just a couple of old blokes who've gone through a different...
Not that old, I hope.
No, but yeah, but compared to the younger generation,
Yeah.
relatively speaking, who have just gone through a different type of upbringing. We have a different set of values, or probably, a different set of values, a different set of things that are more valuable to us relative to the younger generation. We don't abide by, we live on an island, we're nice and safe here, and everything's going to be great. No one's going to come near us. Whereas the other generation, younger generations, tend to think that. Do you think that there's that possibility that we are over egging it, and we are over worrying about these things, and because as we get older, we play more defensive? Do you think that's a possibility? I often wonder myself. I test myself all the time about this.
Well, Mark, I go back to the 2019 election campaign in Warringah, which I lost. Yep. I had young people, often kids still at school, who no doubt had been put up to this by their teachers, but literally quivering with fear and anxiety, telling me that they would probably be dead in a few years' time because of climate change that my government was not, or the party that I was part of was not doing enough to fix. So young people today, I think, are being scared to death over climate anxiety in a way that maybe earlier generations were worried about nuclear war, for instance. Now, I've got to say, I think major conflict between great powers is vastly more scary to me than the possibility of a couple of degrees of warming several decades hence, which we can easily adapt to. There have always been storms, there have always been floods, there have always been fires, there have always been droughts, and the richer and stronger we are, the better we will be able to cope with these things. And if some areas of agriculture shrink and others grow, well, so be it. Again, we can deal with it
and adapt
in the future, as we've always done in the past. But a major war, particularly one involving nuclear weapons, would be a complete catastrophe, an unimaginable disaster. I mean, imagine Sydney being like Mariupol, Imagine Sydney being like Gaza. That's what war does. Uh, and it doesn't matter whether your cause is just. If your country is subject to bombardment, it's ghastly beyond belief. So that's the sort of thing that I think we should be worried about. And the best way to ensure that it doesn't come is not to be weak, because weakness is provocative. It's to be strong, not aggressive, but strong and certain and clear, because the only way we will deter aggressors is by being strong and certain and clear in response. I mean, if Ukraine had been in NATO, Putin would never have invaded. Putin only invaded Ukraine because he thought it would all be over in a week. And it's immensely to the credit of the incredibly gallant and heroic Ukrainians, who I think are fighting for everyone's freedom, that they have been able to resist so successfully for so long. But this is an object lesson in what to do and not to do if your country is to survive and flourish. It is to be strong economically, strong militarily, strong psychologically, and if possible, to have strong alliances as well.
So someone like you, when you see Dan Andrews standing there in China alongside Putin, President Xi, and the North Korean president, it must make your blood boil. because isn't that the opposite? Isn't that, to what you just said, that's the opposite?
Well, there was a phrase, Mark, that I think Lenin used of the capitalists who were going to sell the communists the rope by which the capitalists were hanged. The phrase was useful idiots. Useful idiots. And I think there are lots of useful idiots in Australia at the moment.
So when you look at, let's call it left of politics, it seems to me that there's a lot of ideology pushed into the left. I mean, obviously, ideology is pushed into the right too. And we were talking about the things that form your ideologies, and you talked about your schooling and you talked about your education. And I might just ask you quickly, because we know you became the Prime Minister, but how did you get into politics? What were you doing before politics?
Well, my mother, my father, people like Father Emmett Costello, had well and truly engendered a great interest in history.
In you?
In me. I was fascinated by history, and I guess
Australian history or history?
History generally, but certainly not excluding Australian history, but history generally. And I imbibed the great man theory of history, that the world is shaped by strong individuals who make a difference. I think the world gets better or worse person by person. And if more people make good choices, things improve. If more people make bad choices, things get worse. And obviously, the further up the leadership ladder you are, the more significant your choices become. So I was interested in history. When I got to university, which even in those days, the mid-70s, was dominated by the Green left, I thought, well, this is ridiculous. Let's do what I can to change that. So I ran for student politics, eventually became the SRC president. Worked out along the way that Keynes was right to this extent, at least.
Keynes the economist.
That Keynes the economist was right, at least to this extent, that practical men are slaves to the ideas of long dead economists. So I thought, let's try to enter the battlefield of ideas. I started writing stuff for the Sydney University paper Honi Soit. Eventually, the Honi Soit editors wouldn't publish me.
Because what people don't realise, Honi Soit is left.
So I started getting stuff published in the Herald, the Australian, the Bulletin. Eventually became a journalist. And then I became a political staffer, press secretary to John Hewson when he was leader of the opposition. Then after the 1993 election, for a year or so, I was the initial executive director of Australians for Constitutional Monarchy. And then in 1994, when a fellow called Michael McKellar retired as member for Ringa. I was on holidays at the time, a bit bored. I called my office to see what was happening, and I was told that John Howard wanted to talk to me. So I rang John, and he said, "Look, Tony, Michael McKellar's just retiring as member for Ringa. I think you should throw your hat into the ring for the Liberal pre-selection," which I did. The two favoured candidates were Kevin McCann, at that stage a senior partner in Sydney's biggest law firm, and Peter King, at that stage a leading barrister. Now, Kevin McCann went on to become chairman of Macquarie Bank. Peter King became, for a time, member for Wentworth. But they were the two leading candidates, and I sort of came up the middle and snagged the pre-selection, and I guess then followed 25 tumultuous and largely successful years in the Parliament.
Would you say you loved being in Parliament?
I loved making a difference, and being in Parliament is probably the preeminent way of making a difference in this country.
But what about the joust that happens every day? Like, you're down there in the mothership in Canberra. I guess you're walking down the aisles and you're brushing, past various opposition people. What about the joust? Did you love that part?
Yes and no. I mean, I was regarded as a pretty ferocious parliamentary warrior because you had to be. You had to be. These days, I listen to Parliament and I think, gee whiz, there's far too much mindless abuse, far too much the other mob are all wrong and our mob are all right, when the truth is no one has a monopoly on wisdom. No one's judgments are perfect. All governments get some things wrong. And the truth is best advanced by a civil debate, which at least respects the goodwill of most of the participants. And I think that there's not enough of that in our national conversation these days, and there's certainly not enough of that in the Parliament. Now, some people will say, "Oh, but Abbott, when you were the leader of the House, you were always getting up and having a go at the other side," and that's true. But I'd like to think that I was playing the ball, not the man, and I'd like to think that I was attacking the other side's positions rather than attacking the other side personally. Although I did once say of Kim Beazley that he was a sanctimonious windbag. all jawbone and no backbone.
How'd that go?
I think I got kicked out of the Parliament for that. And look, I've actually got a lot of time for Kim Beazley. I mean, Kim Beazley is probably by far the most substantial figure on the Labor side of politics, at least in recent decades, not to become Prime Minister. And for what it's worth, I think Kim Beazley would have been a pretty good Prime Minister, arguably better than the people who did succeed him and go on to be Prime Minister.
You'll never be accused of being a shrinking violet in politics, and probably in life for that matter. Once you famously shirt-fronted Putin, and it was over, the plane going down above
M817.
Ukraine.
Yep.
And I loved it, to be frank with you. I thought it was fantastic. But not everybody likes that sort of stuff. And I just want to ask you about the Australian mindset, the psyche of Australians. Why wouldn't someone like Trump, for example, do well in Australia? Have we inherited some Anglo-Irish thing about people being too tough, or is it a tall poppy syndrome thing? Or what is it that, Trump will stand up to everybody. You stood up. I'm not sure whether people actually in Australia really like that. What do you think about that?
Look, our system is different from the American system. And to become a national leader in Australia, you've got to be able to secure a parliamentary majority, which means that you've got to have a degree of respect and perhaps some level of affection from your peers.
Your peers being your political peers.
Your political peers, your fellow members of parliament in your particular party. The American system is quite different because the party structures are much looser. Party discipline is not nearly as tight. The primary system means that charismatic individuals can emerge from nowhere. I mean, Donald Trump had never held elective office when he ran for the Republican nomination. He'd actually been a Democrat as well as a Republican, as well as neither over the years. He'd created, I suppose, some kind of a profile via reality TV. And I guess the fact that he was a billionaire who was often in the media, at least in New York, gave him a certain cachet. But I don't think someone like Donald Trump could emerge in Australia. I think the most that someone like Donald Trump could do in Australia would be to perhaps elbow his way into the Senate, where if you can get a quota, which is about, I think, 12% of the vote or 14% of the vote, you're there as a senator. But I don't think a Trump-like figure could readily emerge in Australia.
Do you think Australians, because I mean, I'm not sure, but I feel as though Trump did not help Peter Dutton in the last election.
Well, it's interesting that Anthony Albanese is now best mates with Donald Trump.
That might work against him.
Because during the election, the Labor Party tried to smear Dutton via association with Donald Trump. Now,
you probably didn't even know him.
Well, look, I'd be very confident that Peter Dutton didn't know Trump, certainly, and our country is different. I mean, yes, there are a lot of commonalities between Australia and the United States. I do think that the English-speaking countries are, in a sense, family, but your brother and your sister can be quite different from you, even if there are some things you've got in common. So look, America is a great country. Americans are great people. Their political system is quite different from ours. Their political psyche, I think, is quite different from ours. And Trump plays better in the United States than he does anywhere else. But this is not uncommon. I mean, I can remember George W. Bush didn't play very well in Australia, whereas Tony Blair, and they were both, I suppose, very frequently in our media at the time of the Iraq War. Personally, I thought Tony Blair was a vastly better advocate for the policies that Britain, Australia and America were pursuing at that time than George W. Bush was. And that's not because George W. Bush was a lesser man. I just think that American style sometimes doesn't translate very well to other countries.
So it would not be advisable for any Australians who are ambitious and aspiring to be perhaps to lead a party in this country to run that type of politics.
Well, I think if you're a would-be Australian leader on the left, Bob Hawke should be your exemplar, and on the right, John Howard should be your exemplar.
That's very interesting. So I want to talk about your book. I mean, I'm dying to know why you wrote a book. I mean, you're not doing it for the money, because I know there won't be any money in it. I've written books. There's never any money in books, and they take a long time to do. It's a mission. It's a massive mission. How long did it take you to write it for a start?
Look, I think I was from start to finish. It would have been probably 3.5, maybe even 4 years. I mean, it all started when John Roscombe, the then head of the Institute of Public Affairs, with whom I was doing an occasional podcast, we were talking about, I guess, what ailed our country, and we mutually decided that not enough people were sufficiently familiar with our history, and those that were tended to see it all in black armband terms of dispossession, even genocide against Aboriginal people. And I guess I then decided that I could put together a general history of the country, a more upbeat general history of the country, and John very kindly offered to give me some research assistance. So work started 3.5, 4 years ago. Eventually, I had what I thought was a good draft. I suggested to Paul Whitaker that maybe HarperCollins might like to publish. HarperCollins eventually agreed, and they had various queries, suggestions, which involved a lot of rewriting, if you like, revising, adding, subtracting, and so on. So I know if I'm writing a speech, for instance, sometimes it'll flow very easily, and the first draft is pretty much the final draft. But sometimes I'll write it and I'll rewrite it and I'll rewrite it again, and it might go through 3 or 4 major iterations. This book, I have read it so many times, and every time I read it, I would change something because I was thinking to myself, is that, do I really need that fact? Should I include this fact? Is that the right way to look at this? Maybe I need to be more generous about that. So, yeah, in the end, these things, the facts are sacred, and you've got to try to ensure that all the important facts are there and are accurately presented. Then, of course, there's, I suppose, your interpretations, and I guess it is, in a sense, part of the subjective process deciding which facts are relevant and which ones aren't. But facts are so important, and this was the first book I've done, which was, if you like, a study as opposed to a piece of advocacy. I mean, if what you are doing is putting forward an argument, you can often write it out of your own head, particularly if it's an argument that you've been making for a long time. But if it's going to be a credible study, you've got to do a lot of research or get a lot of research done.
So you're I think what you're saying, though, and correct me if I'm wrong, it wasn't you prosecuting any case.
No.
It was
Well, except for the fact that I think the Australian story, on balance, is a very good one.
So did you discover that during your research, or you already thought that?
I have always thought
Instinctively.
that. Instinctively, and based on my general knowledge of Australian history, I have always thought that our story was a good one, and I've always tended to arc up when people have suggested otherwise. And I thought, well, let's, given the degree of ignorance, given the degree of what might be described as prejudice, I thought, let's tell the story. Let's tell the story again, more or less from the beginning, right up to the present time. Let's try to be as objective as possible. Let's try to respect all the important facts, but and let's see what they amount to. And to me, when you think that modern Australia began when 1,500 bedraggled souls were dumped not far from here, half a world away from their home, in a completely strange, unfamiliar, alien landscape, within 100 years, they had created colonies with the world's highest standard of living at the time. They had become democratic pioneers, almost the first places where every man and then every woman, and indeed people of all races, had the vote, was in Australia.
Is that right? Australian women?
Absolutely. In South Australia, by the 1890s, men, women, and Aboriginal people, they could all vote, they could all run for office. And there's almost nowhere in the world at the time where that was true.
What do you put that down to in your research?
Well, there was a liberal humanity to modern Australia from the very start. The British government instructed Governor Phillip to live in amity with the natives. And when Governor Phillip was speared at Manly Cove, quite badly hurt at Manly Cove on the search for Bennelong, instead of mounting a punitive raid and slaughtering all the Aboriginal people he could find, Phillip put it down to a misunderstanding. And Bennelong eventually came back and continued to live with Phillip at Government House, and eventually went to England with Phillip when Phillip went back in 1792. So there was a liberal humanity about Australia from the very beginning. We should never forget that white men were hanged for the murder of black people after the Myall Creek Massacre as early as 1838. By the time the free settlers started to come in very large numbers, the 1820s, the 1830s, Chartism was very much alive and well in England, and a lot of the free settlers were highly influenced by that. Henry Parkes in particular, who became the great statesman of 19th century New South Wales. He was a Chartist originally. So there was a strong instinct in colonial Australia for free institutions where Jack was as good as his master. We were fundamentally liberal societies.
Liberal, you mean, you don't mean as in Liberal Party now, you mean liberal thinking.
Liberal thinking, liberality, if you like, humanitarianism.
Yep.
Now, political liberalism developed slightly differently in Victoria and in New South Wales. Deacon liberalism in Victoria was statist liberalism. In order to better secure human flourishing, we need a big state. Reid liberalism in New South Wales was more small government liberalism. In order to secure human flourishing, we need government to stay in its lane and allow individuals the greatest possible freedom. So there were two strands of liberalism in colonial Australia, but nevertheless, it was a fundamentally liberal project.
So, in terms of, we're talking a modern history, obviously. How do you treat Indigenous Australia within the book?
Mm-hmm. Well, I say constantly in the book that modern Australia rests on three pillars: an Indigenous heritage, a British foundation, and an immigrant character. And I think that's unarguable. I think these are simple facts that all must accept. How much emphasis they wish to place on them is obviously a question for people's individual judgments. But I think modern Australia's, mindset owes something to the fatalism, the laconic endurance of Aboriginal people. These days, it tends to be very much portrayed as the horrible colonists oppressing, exploiting, and often enough killing the innocent Aboriginal people. That's a total caricature of what happened. Let's take very early modern Australia and its relationship with Aboriginal people. There was Bennelong, who exemplified the cooperation between the settlers and Aboriginal people. And then there was Pemulwuy, who exemplified, if you like, the conflict between settlers and Aboriginal people. The interesting thing is that both Bennelong and Pemulwuy were respected and admired by the best of the settlers. Pemulwuy was a warrior, as was Bennelong, but Pemulwuy was a warrior who often engaged in acts of violence against the settlers, for which ultimately he was killed. But he was well respected. Governor King, who was the governor at the time Pemulwuy was killed, said he was a stout fellow who fought for his people. And as our history develops and the great pastoral expansion takes place beyond the Blue Mountains. Obviously, on the frontiers, there was tremendous conflict, the Myall Creek Massacre simply being the best known instance of terrible conflict. But at the same time, there was also great cooperation. I mean, none of the explorers would have got to where they got without Aboriginal guides. None of the pastoralists would have been able to flourish without Aboriginal stockmen and shepherds and so on. So this idea that the history of Australia is of bloody conflict between white and black, it's simply not true. There was at least as much cooperation as there was conflict. And at all times, official Australia was determined to do the right thing towards the Aboriginal people that every governor stressed were as much British subjects as the white settlers were.
Do you think Australians, once they read your book, should be, or maybe I'll put it another way, do you think you're much prouder of being being an Australian, as a result of writing your book?
Well, I think I had a strong sense of the history already. In the course of writing the book, I was reminded of things that I'd forgotten, and I discovered things that I didn't know. But I believe that I had a strong sense of our history anyway, and I certainly had a great pride in our country anyway.
Anything surprise you?
Well, figures who you'd hardly heard of suddenly leap out of the page when you go into their lives more deeply. I mean, one person who I think should be better known to contemporary Australians is John Plunkett, who was the first Attorney General of New South Wales. It was Plunkett who insisted that the Myall Creek Massacre perpetrators be put on trial. And when the first jury refused to convict, it was Plunkett who brought fresh charges against a slightly lesser number of perpetrators and persuaded a couple of the perpetrators to turn Queen's evidence. And with another judge who said at the second trial's close that this was an atrocity crying out to heaven for justice, the second jury did convict, and 7 of the perpetrators were subsequently hanged, which was justice according to law in those days. Now, Plunkett was an Irish Catholic with a strong sense of justice, a strong sense of the universality of rights, and he did a lot to try to ensure that the law wasn't just fair, but was fairly applied in the colony. And I think that he's a fragrant individual who deserves to be much better remembered than he is.
You just talked about some pretty important words there: fairness, justice, just to pick two. And you mentioned Irish Catholic, and it's well known that you're a man of faith, and that you are. And faith is really important to you.
Don't put me on any pedestal of virtue, though, please.
But
mate.
I'm not going to put you on a virtuous pedestal. And by the way, a lot of people of faith, that's the last place they should be put, because sometimes they struggle, with humanity and faith and everything else. And one of the things I've always wanted to ask someone like you, if you don't mind me asking you, is how does somebody who has a strong belief in their faith and probably turns to their faith often and has been brought up in that environment, how does someone like you reconcile belief with, you're also a man of history, with facts? Like, how do you reconcile those things? Do I believe in God, but at the same time I'm quite practical? I'm now a person of history, and I'm watching the facts, and I'm writing about the facts, about the way things happened. How do you reconcile those two things?
Well, maybe I haven't thought deeply enough about it, Mark, but I've got to say that I've never had a particular problem. I think I guess the thing that most perplexes people, or most frequently perplexes people, is the problem of evil. How does a good God allow evil things to
Good
happen?
example.
And I've always accepted that God gave human beings agency, and often enough, flawed
Agency
and
being
fallible,
choice.
flawed and fallible human beings will make bad choices, sometimes downright evil choices. And look, he created a natural world where I suppose nature does things which hurt people, storms, floods, etc. But again, um, this is the natural world that God created, um, and we are in this natural world um, to make the best of things, to make the most of things, and it's how we handle the challenges that we face in our lives, which I guess is the measure of us. And hopefully we'll measure up, and one day St. Peter will welcome us through the pearly gates.
As well, because I often think about someone like Albert Einstein, who was
Mm,
Jewish by faith and obviously lived by that faith. But at the same time, he was opining on relativity and
mm.
all sorts of formulas like E equals mc squared, working out he didn't quite get to this point, but his stuff led to subatomic particles, and all of us are made up of these little bits and pieces that we can't even see or even contemplate.
But
Do you think that,
knowing more, I think just adds to the sense of awe and wonder
where did it start?
at how it's all come about. And I guess I don't think something as incredible and as wonderful as the natural world, and indeed the human world,
In the
just
universe?
happened by accident. I accept that at some point in time, a good God created all of this, and our challenge as people who are in some way in the image of likeness of God is to be our best selves, to come closer to being our best selves every day.
Does Tony Abbott ever struggle with these things? Do you ever look at what's going on in, say, places where people are in terrible conditions and dying? Do you ever struggle with that?
Well, I lament it, but the struggle is to make things better, not to despair. So I think the problem with atheism, as I understand it, is that it often leads people to despair.
Because there's no answer.
And despair can lead people to suicide. It can lead people to neglect of their fundamental responsibilities. And I mean, for instance, how many atheist hospitals are there? How many atheist schools are there? So much of the things that we value and take for granted are the product of religious endeavour, or more broadly, the inspiration of religious faith. And I just think that's almost self-evident.
And making things better. Do you think that's one of the things that drove Tony Abbott to one day become, or want to become, the leader of this country?
Yeah, look, the Jesuits back in my day had this, if you like, injunction to be a man for others. And while there are all sorts of different and valid ways of being a man for others, I always thought that for me, being a man for others was making a difference in as widespread a way as possible. And I guess that's what led me into journalism and politics.
And your book, it's called Australia.
Australia, a history.
Can I ask you about a history,
Yeah.
not the history? Was there some thought about which indefinite article or definite article I was going to put in front of the history? Did you decide it should be a history? In other words, it's an objective and not subjective?
Well, plainly, it is possible to put a different interpretation on the same facts. I mean, for instance, let's take for argument's sake the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The American interpretation is that this was necessary to end the most destructive war in history. I suspect the Japanese interpretation is slightly different.
Yes.
Although to the great credit of modern Japan, they have accepted
Or reconciled.
that and are reconciled very much to the Americans and have greatly embraced democracy and the rule of law and concepts of justice and freedom and so on. So it was, in the end, you're right. I thought A History was a better title than The History.
Yeah, because I thought it might have been done on purpose.
I accept that others might see things differently, but I have tried to tell the story of Australia as objectively as I can. And the subtitle, How an Ancient Land Became a Great Democracy, I think is an indication of the fact that I at the very least want to see our story as a glass half full rather than a glass half empty.
And do you think Tony Abbott today, more mature, past those periods in your life where you were a PM and an active politician, is a much more humble person, displays much more humility? Do you feel that about yourself?
Well, Mark, I am a little reluctant to put tags on myself because.
Well, how important is humility to you then?
Well, humility is a very important human quality, a very important human quality, and none of us like individuals who are full of themselves and who are self-obsessed. I would not want to claim to be free of the vice of self-importance, but I certainly I dislike it in others, and if it's present in myself, I should try to get rid of it.
Well, my sense is that it's not present in yourself, just in terms of this conversation. And I think as we get older, maybe it's only one of the few benefits getting older, is that wisdom sort of bestows a few of these things upon us, and we start to be able to reflect on ourselves a bit better than we ever did when we were younger.
But I think some of us improve with age because we become wiser and perhaps more compassionate, perhaps more sensitive. Others become more impatient, more difficult. Perhaps in some ways we can be both deeper and less patient at the same time. I know I'm less patient now than I was. I was probably never very patient.
Oh, I'm the same. Are you still a member of the surf club?
I am still
active.
I'm a life member of the surf
Yep.
club. I haven't done patrols for a couple of years. The pandemic and the fact that there were no patrols for ridiculous reasons in 2022 that was the end of my patrolling. But I'm still a very active member of the Rural Fire Service. I'm now a member of two brigades, the Davidson Brigade, which I've been in for 25 years or more, and in more recent times I've become a member of the North Arm Cove Brigade up at Port Stephens.
And famously, you were, the budgie smugglers.
Yeah.
Do you still get your budgies?
Yeah.
Good man. Mm-hmm. And do you ever? I said to you earlier about the shirt fronting of Putin. I think that was, for me, one of the great moments in Australian politics. Do you think we don't get enough of that today?
Well, I wish I'd been able to do more than just shirt front Putin, because Putin, he's done monstrous things, absolutely monstrous things. I mean, the initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014 was a horrible, horrible act of aggression. And what he's now embarked upon is effectively a campaign of extermination against the Ukrainian nation. And I just think that's evil, absolutely evil, and it must be resisted. And I wish we were doing more to help the Ukrainians.
As in Australia? Yeah, me too. Well, Tony, this has been a great pleasure. I'm good luck with the book, mate. I guess people can buy it on Booktopia and all the usual places.
All the usual places.
All the usual places.
And there's a doco as well that they can get on the Sky website. They've got the Foxtel app. They can get it through that. The doco,
3-part series.
3-part documentary is outstanding.
Yeah, I've listened
Really
to it.
wonderful.
I've actually listened on the radio.
Okay.
You can listen on the radio as well, because what happens, Sky plays it,
Right.
and you can actually listen to it as well
Okay.
on radio. So I've been listening to it at night.
But the pictures are worth watching too. I
Yeah.
mean, it's beautifully done. Now, the book I take 100% responsibility for. The doco I presented, and the doco was inspired by the book and is faithful to the book, but in the end, the credit belongs to Sky and the producer Alex Garipoli, who did just the most wonderful job.
And is there many illustrations in the book?
The book's got, I think, 16 pages or something of photographs. And if you want to get a rough idea of where I'm going, flick through the photos, because the captions and the little narrations at the bottom of the photos helps to tell the story.
Thanks for signing, Stoney. So this is the book, How an Ancient Land Became a Great Democracy, Australia, a History. I really love the cover, actually. And
it's beautifully presented, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is something you should be proud of. Did you do an audio book, mate?
I did.
In your voice?
In my voice. It was about 12 hours of narration.
Yeah, and it's quite hard, isn't it? Because you're sitting there and there's a dude in a box, with a soundproof box,
occasionally telling you, no, you didn't get that right.
you mumbled.
Or I think you've mispronounced that word or something like that.
A word you wrote.
Yeah.
And what's interesting too, and I found, I did it again, I wonder what you found, is that when you were reading aloud what you had written for someone to read, did you think to yourself at any stage, wow, maybe I could have changed that a little bit?
Well, obviously, if you are writing for something to be read, that is often a bit different to writing for something to be spoken.
Yeah.
And occasionally, I thought this sentence is a bit too long. It should have been broken up for the purposes of the audio book. But I've got to say, there were fewer moments than I thought there would be when reading it out aloud, I felt that there was infelicity of one sort or another. I did come across one egregious error, which I like to think must have been the fault of the publisher as opposed to the author. But nevertheless, I've got to say that I think that it's come up wonderfully well. The publishers have done a great job. The cover is, I think, beautiful. Interestingly, Graham Edwards Peacock, the artist whose painting forms the cover, exemplifies, if you like, the early Australian story. He was a lawyer in London who was sentenced to death for forgery. It was commuted to transportation for life. He gets to Port Macquarie. Because of his education, he's immediately given a ticket of leave and works in the administration of the penal settlement at Port Macquarie. He brings his family out to join him. He then gets a job as effectively a meteorologist at the South Head Weather Station, and while there develops his skills as an artist, becomes one of our more notable early colonial artists, and his work, as I said, adorns the cover. But he is typical of how people made the most of their second chance, made the most of the opportunities that life in Australia gave them.
Thank God, because my mother's, one of my mother's family on my mother's side was on the Sirius.
Okay.
And they first, as you know, they first arrived in South Head and stopped at a place called Camp Cove.
And there's a plaque there marking the spot.
And I live in the very first house ever built in Camp Cove in 1896, and it was given to a Russian scientist because it was the first marine biological station in the Southern Hemisphere.
Wow.
And I feel as though, and the reason I've always wanted to live there is because of my mother's side of the family first coming in on one of the ships.
Well, it's a wonderful place to live. I occasionally have a cup of coffee at Camp Cove when I'm cycling around the eastern suburbs, and it's a gorgeous spot.
You're one of those guys I can hear get in there early in the morning up the top there, up the place called Green Point, and I can hear your voices. I'm going to be looking out for you next time. I'm going to come and say, hey, mate.
Could possibly be there on Saturday morning. You never know.
I might see you. Tony Abbott, a great pleasure, mate.
Thank you, Mark.